We are gonna take off with a panel with women in the labor market. We have, like in the former panels, we will have 2 academics and 1 practitioner. So we will begin with Professor Paola Profeta from Bocconi University, which, by the way, mentioned yesterday. She is going to talk about the economic benefit of gender diversity on board. She's the utmost expert on boards. I'm so happy to have Paola again in one of our events. Then we're going to go with Ariane Hogish. She's a senior research fellow at the Institute for Women Policy Research. And she's going to talk about work-family policies and women employment in a comparative perspective. And then we will move to a practitioner, Colleen Frank, and she is a luxury sales and merchandising executive. Most lately, she was vice president of Longchamp and USA, and she is going to talk about her own experience doing business as a woman in Europe and in the US. What are the differences? She also studied in Europe and the US, so she was the most well fit for that. And with no further ado, Paola, off you go to you.
Okay, so thank you very much. I hope that you can hear well. I'm trying to share my screen, and thank you very much for the invitation. I'm sorry I can't be there with you in person, but I will present. Okay, so I think you can see my screen now, right?
1 second.
And okay, and I'll try to put this in full screen. Okay. So, so I will talk about economic benefits of gender diversity on corporate boards, in particular with the reference to some European cases, and in particular to the Italian case. So, as you know, women are still underrepresented in top positions. So the phenomenon is well known as the glass ceiling, but we also know that in general, exploiting female talents is at the center of the agenda in many countries, institutions, firms, and many stakeholders. So the question here that I'm trying to address, and that this has been at the center of my research for many years now, is whether there are, and in this case, which are the economic benefits of a gender balanced leadership. So of having men and women together in leadership positions. And I've been studying this topic from several perspectives, in particular, both with reference to business, so boards, and with reference to politics. So today I will talk mainly about boards. So that's the situation of boards in Europe. So in this graph, I show the share of women among presidents, board members, and employee representatives of the largest listed companies in Europe. The data are quite recent. They come from the European Institute of Gender Equality. You see there is a large variation across countries. Iceland performed particularly well, so they are very close to 50%, which is obviously the equilibrium, the perfect gender balance. And then we have France, Norway, Italy also performs quite well with respect to the presence of women in those top positions, and we will see also why and how. And then you have all the other countries, so there is a huge variation. And in particular, a lot of attention has been concentrated in the last decades about how to promote female leadership, and in particular on one instrument and one tool which has been used widely in Europe, which are gender quotas. So gender quotas have been introduced both in business and in politics, and they have attracted a lot of attention in the policy debate, starting from the pioneer experience of Norway, which introduced quotas on boards of directors for listed companies back in 2004, and then followed by Italy, France, Germany, and many other European countries. Now, there is also this European directive, which was proposed several years ago, but was somehow never approved, and now it has received a new attention and has attracted again the attention of policymakers. So we are again in this debate on the introduction of gender quotas on boards of directors in order to promote female leadership. So, of course, quotas are quite controversial issue, as always, not only in the field of boards, but in general, because on one side, it may be seen as a needed or kind of necessary instrument to achieve gender balanced representation at the top of the economic and political positions. But on the other side, especially in countries where it's very difficult to reach this outcome without, let's say, kind of a strong push or commitment, but on the other side, quotas may have negative effects, and the literature has largely discussed this, starting from the possible negative effects on quality of representatives, or even negative effects on performance or stock market, etc. So there are a lot of papers. I will try to summarize briefly the literature and then propose you, show you what are the results about of my research on this topic. But of course, it has always been a quite controversial, let's say, issue. So from a research point of view and from a methodological point of view, the introduction of gender quotas is somehow very useful in order to do academic research. And that is because quotas are somehow an exogenous change in the share of women. And therefore, they can be useful to overcome the typical endogeneity problem that arises in this type of studies, which means if we want to understand what is the contribution of the share of women on several outcomes, for example, on performance or on selection or stock market, etc., it's very difficult to establish causality and therefore to go beyond a simple correlation, because we never know whether it's the presence of women that is responsible of, let's say, a certain outcome in terms of performance or other outcomes that we want to measure, or we never know if this is the type of relationship, or if the relationship goes the other way around, which means that, for example, firms that perform better appoint more women on their boards. So it's very difficult to identify causality in this type of questions or research questions, this type of studies. And this is why there is also a lot of attention from many non-academic institutions that mainly provide correlations, sometimes robust correlations, but what is very difficult is to identify causality. So if we observe that companies that have more women on board perform better, the question is whether we may claim that it's the presence of women to be responsible of this better performance, or many other things that may have happened at the same time. So the fact that women increase because of the existence of quotas may be useful if we want really to identify a causal effect, which is what the research is typically doing in this very recent period. But let me go back a little bit to the literature and to the evidence. So we have, when we talk about gender quotas on boards, so we are concentrated on boards of directors of large companies, let's say listed companies. The evidence which is most known is the one referred to Norway. Norway introduced the quotas, which imply 40% of both gender, at least in late 2003, 2004. And there are now a lot of papers about Norway, and they mainly suggest different results. First of all, they conclude that the gender quota law has been effective in increasing the number of women on boards up to the threshold of 40%. So basically, this is an effective tool if you want to reach this gender balance. But on the other side, it may not be as good as for other outcomes. For example, it seems that the benefits, let's say, remain with the group of women on boards, and do not produce like cascade effects on other positions. So there's a recent paper that shows that there are no clear effects on reducing gender gaps within the firms at other positions. Some old paper also found a kind of negative impact on the stock market. So they say that they seem to suggest, using several techniques in financial economics, that the presence of women on boards of directors may be even negative for performance of the company, because these people who enter are typically not experienced. So these women have not the good experience to be at that place. But that, which was an old paper by Aine Dittmar, has been largely criticized by other papers that also find that somehow it was not robust to all the identification threads that are implied in this type of analysis. And other papers also find that there was a reduction in profits because women tend to fire less people, and therefore we have this evidence. So I'm going to concentrate on a different case, which is the case of Italy, which is the case of which I have analyzed largely in the last, let's say, almost 10 years now. And the case of Italy is particularly interesting because we have seen in Italy the introduction of board gender quotas. The introduction goes back to laws, let's say the law which was called 120 of 2011. And basically, since the introduction of board gender quotas in Italy, the share of women on boards has increased substantially. You see in this graph, I have reconstructed the presence of women on boards of directors of listed companies from 1934 up to very recent. And you see that the percentage was always very low. It's been very, very low until the introduction of the quotas. So basically, it was 7%, around 7% before the introduction of quotas, and then it increased substantially up to the recent 40, close to 40% percentage. So why is the Italian context particularly interesting? Because it's a context characterized typically by high gender gaps in the labor market. So it's a place, it's still a country where female labor force participation is particularly low. It's around 49, 50%. So more or less 1 out of 2 women work in Italy, and the other don't work. So it's very low also with respect to all European statistics. So basically, the female participation rate in the labor market in Italy is one of the lowest, with the only exception of Greece, Malta, and Cyprus, overall Europe. And also a place where women basically had no access to these positions before the gender quotas, because their percentage, their share in these positions was around 7%. So what is particularly interesting is to understand how this has worked in this particular case. So this law, which was called the 120 of 2011, introduced quotas on boards of directors and also statutory auditors for publicly listed companies. And then it was also extended to state-owned companies, which means also a larger share, a larger group. The law is called Goal for Mosca from the names of the two main supporters of the law, and it dates back to 2011, but basically it was implemented starting in August 2012. So in 2011, March 15, the draft was approved by the Senate, and then the law was approved by the Parliament at the end of June 2011. But there was kind of 1 year transition year for the implementation, which starts the year later. So there are several characteristics. First of all, it applies not only to publicly listed companies, but also to state-owned companies. And Italy has the kind of dual system. Typically in firms, there are board of directors and board of statutory auditors, and both of them are targeted by the law. And another important characteristic, which is quite different with respect to Norway and all the other European experience, is that it's a temporary measure. So basically, the idea is that these quotas are in place only for 3 consecutive board elections, starting August 2012. Then it has been recently, let's say, prolonged for other 3 board elections, but not on permanent basis. So here, the main idea was that the country needs a kind of shock in terms of having more women in leadership positions, but this measure was not considered necessary, let's say, or at least we will see. But at that time of the approval was considered like a temporary measure. So at some point we will not need it anymore, because we really need to somehow break down an equilibrium where women basically are absent from this positions. Another important characteristic is the gradual implementation. So at the first board elections, the quota is only 20%, so 1 out of 5 members of the boards have to be of each gender. So at the least, the less represented gender should have at least 20% of the members, and then the quotas increases up to 1/3. And then when it was prolonged, it was also increased up to 40%. The sanctions are very strong. So this is something that which is called the hard law. So it's not a recommendation. It's not something that you can avoid. So basically, the sanctions culminate into the dissolution of the board. And this is also why all companies comply with this law. So there were no fines, and it's 100% compliance. It's very, very strong. In terms of requirements. Okay, so here what we can do is to have kind of 2 types of analysis, and I'm going to concentrate on the analysis, let's say, in the short term, because this is the study that I have conducted in the past year, and finally has been published in Management Science. It's a paper with Giulia Ferrari, Valeria Ferraro, and Chiara Pronzato, where we analyze the effects of the introduction of board gender quotas on selection, performance, and the stock market. Of course, what is also particularly interesting, and we are starting to work also in this direction, but we need more time to have results, is to understand whether in the long run there are also cascade effects. So having more gender balance in top positions also means that we have more women in other positions of the firms, or overall we are going to reduce the gender gaps. If there are any effects in terms of changing the culture of the company, changing the culture of let's say the company, and overall in general of our society. And also what will be particularly interesting when, since I told you that it's a temporary measure, when it will be removed, so it will not be in place anymore, we will go to see, if the effects are persistent. So if we continue to have women on board's position, or we go back to the initial situation. This is something that we will understand after. At the end of the removal. Okay, so let me give you a brief review, let's say preview of the results, just because I don't want to, in case I don't arrive to the end. In terms of selection, we are going to find positive effects in terms of selection. So basically this idea that you introduce quotas and at the end, this is very bad because the quality of the representatives decrease, we are not going to find it. We actually find that the level, for example, of education of the member of the board increases, not only for women, but also for men. And this is a kind of a new result, which we have found also in other contexts. For example, at some point I analyzed gender, the equal gender balance and gender quotas in politics, and we found a similar result. There are other papers around, but the idea is that quotas are not necessarily bad in terms of the quality of representatives. It really depends on the status quo. In this case, they may be good because they force somehow to have a better selection. In terms of performance, we are not going to find any significant effect in terms of, it's not true that because of the quotas, there are more women and firms perform better, so they have higher profits, etc., but not even worse. So we find like neutral results, but we find a reduction of the variability of stock prices. And finally, in terms of the stock market, we are going to find that the market does not have any negative reaction, which was the result found in Norway, but actually there are positive results in terms of the announcement of the law. So there are better firms returns at the board elections with the quota. So investors seem to appreciate the fact that women are appointed because of the quota. So that's a good result because we are talking about listed companies. Okay, so in the identification analysis for this paper, we use something particularly interesting in the timing of the reform. As I said before, the timing is as follows. The law was approved in August 2011, but with 1 year of phasing process, which means that it is implemented 1 year later. So the reform period starts in August 2012. And elections for boards of directors in Italian companies happen every 3 years. So basically the board, which is elected, for example, in 2007, is then elected again in 2010, and then elected again in 2013. So we have a kind of first cohort of firms with elections in these 3 years, and the election in 2007 and 2010 are without the quotas, and then the one in 2015 is with the quotas. So we can identify effects by looking at what happened in different periods of time. And again, for the second cohort, it will be 2008, 2011, again without the quotas because they are not mandatory, and then 2014 with the quotas. So if you compare what is the composition of the boards in different periods of time, you can identify somehow the effects of the quotas. And this is what we are going to do. We collected a lot of data from companies listed on the Italian Stock Exchange. Some data are not publicly available. I mean, are available, but you have to collect them because they are not already in the same place. So we have individual data. So we know all the characteristics of the members of the companies, of the boards, member, men and women. We have firm level data and stock market data. And at the end, what was more let's say, time-consuming was to find all the CV with all the individual characteristics of board members elected in this period. So we had to go one by one into the inspection of this CV. Because the council, which is the authority which has to control the implementation of the law in listed companies, provides all information on the name, gender, and all of the members, but we really wanted their age, their level of education, their positions, their state of birth and residence, if they are presidents, vice presidents, CEO, administrator, their field of education, if they are related with other members of the board in terms of family relationships, etc. So we had to collect a lot of information. We complement, so at the end, we are going to identify these variables, which are women's empowerment. So we calculate the share of women on boards, and also whether this share exceeds the first threshold, which was 20%, because we want to understand whether having the quota means that you really stay at the minimum when you appoint women, or given that you have a push in order to look for more women, then even more than 20% are appointed. We construct measures for the level of education, for the age, for the family relationships, and also for the multiple positions. At the firm level, we have all possible information related to their profits, to their return on assets, number of employees, Tobin skew, all the variables which are typically used to assess the performance of a company. And at the stock market level, we have the daily closing prices. Okay, so I'm not going to go into too many details because of the time in terms of the econometric analysis, but basically what we do, as I said, is to compare elections with the board, with the quotas, with elections without the quotas for the same firm. So with the fixed effect at the level of the firm, and with all the characteristics. And since the elections for different firms happen at different time, we also have to make some assumptions on the evolution of other variables over time, which means that Even in absence of the quotas, for example, the share of women on boards in 2007 does not necessarily mean that it is the same as the one in 2010 or 2014. So we have to assume that there is a kind of underlying trend, which depends on the fact that time passes and there are more women. And on top of that, we want to understand what is the impact of the quotas. But we have to assume that there is a kind of trend. So we make several assumptions on this trend, maybe the absence of a trend, the linear trend, or the trend described by the data, which is a technique which we call, it's called the non-parametric technique. Because what we want to say, of course, we don't have two groups like a treated and control group at the same time. So every firm becomes the control group of itself in absence of the quotas. So these are graphical results that show you a little bit already what we have, what we find. The first graph is the percentage of women, and you see that you see the evolution before the reform, and then the triangle represents what happened after the reform, and you see that this really is much higher. So the triangle is much higher with respect to the trend before, which is the impact of the presence of quotas. Even for the more than 20% of women, you see the triangle up there, which means that these are really very far from the trend so far. So it means that companies really use the quotas to increase the share of women even more than the 20% that was required at the beginning. Then I have the college degrees, and so the share, the percentage of college degrees, men and women together, and again you see the triangles much higher with respect to what was the trend without the quotas, so before the reform, and which means that somehow it's a graphical, it's a visual example of our results, showing that there are more people educated, board members educated after the reform. And also you see here the other education also for the graduate studies. This is even larger, even more impressive. And younger than 55, which means also that there is a clear decrease in the share of elderly people. So more people that are younger than 55 after the reform. So these are our visual results in terms of the selection effect. I also have tables, but I don't think it's necessary to go through them because it's a little bit too much. I will leave you this if you want to read it. You see very clearly from, let me show somehow the sum up of this regression analysis. The reform is associated with an increase of the share of women directors. So the increase is really substantial, between 11.41 and 16.32 percentage points. So that was expected because, as I said before, you cannot escape the law. So you have to put more women. But what was not expected is that once you start this process, so you ask firms to have more women on boards, then firms add even more than the minimum required, because in our case, there is a significant increase in the share of women even over the initial request that was only 20%. There is also some kind of positive effect in terms of selection. So members with a graduate degree increases between 2.55 and 4.05 percentage points. This is very significantly. Also, more people who have studied abroad. So it's a kind of more qualifications, not only for women, but also for men, which is the nice part of the quotas. So it's a kind of way also to rethink the composition of the board. And on lower age of board members, so it's kind of renovation also in terms of the board members. We don't find instead significant changes in the number of board members with the family relationship or the increase of multiple positions. So that was also something found, for example, in Norway, the same woman everywhere. We don't have significant effects of this in our case. So basically, even here, I have some kind of closer look. If you compare the share of individuals, the share of board members that were, say, retained from previous election, exiting a new entry in 2011. In this case, in this table simply those in 2011 compared with those in 2014. 11 is without the quotas, 14 is with the quota. You see that there is a kind of renovation of the board, fully renovation, because now the new members are typically more educated than both the retain and those who exit. And also with respect to what happened in 2011, and this is true not only for women but also for men. So there's a kind of process that happens not only for, let's say, because women are somehow qualified, but also men are better selected when there are quotas on boards. The second part, the second outcome that we wanted to understand was performance, as I said before. And in this case, what we try to assess, I mean, this is quite easy identification here, because we use the reform as an instrument for the share of women. So basically here, we know that if the board is subject to the reform, it has to increase the share of women, and it's pretty easy to show that this type of instrument is good because it's strictly related with the share of women, but it does not have anything to do directly with performance. So it's not, there is no need. So the kind of what we call an exclusion restriction is somehow satisfied. We also use as instrument the distance with respect to the threshold. So instead of the share of women, how distant you are from the threshold, and the interaction term between reform and distance. So we basically use all our outcomes, as I said before, in terms of employment, productivity, profits, assets, return on assets, Tobin skill. We don't need to know exactly what these things mean, but you know, in financial economics, they are the typical outcomes that I use to assess the performance of the company. And here, basically, it's a kind of, I mean, the table simply show that there is nothing significant. So the only significant effect that we find is in the last column, which is the reduction of the standard deviation of stock prices. So it seems that when there are more women, there is a kind of reduction in the variability, which is also in line with the idea that, you know, women are more risk averse, and so they reduce the variability of profits. And this is very robust identification because, as I said, we have firm fixed effect, time fixed effect, and a lot of robustness analysis at the first stage of the instrumental variable regression. And the last result is the one in terms of the stock market. So what happens on the stock market? This is listed companies. So are investors happy about the quotas or are somehow not? And here what you see is that basically in the 2 dates of the announcement, we do this exercise both on June 28th, on March 15th, nothing, I mean, we don't find any significant effect. So it seems that they are still there waiting for what is going to happen at the election. So because at the election, you see the people, you see these women, you know whether they are good or bad. And therefore, nothing particularly happens. These are event studies at these 2 crucial dates. So the cumulative abnormal returns of the company at that time in the 2 days are not significantly different from zero. While at the election, we find some positive effects because for board elections in companies, we run an event study over each board election, compute the cumulative abnormal returns for different event windows. And what we find is that that basically the firms, the firms that, sorry. Okay, the firms that have elections and that are more distant, that have elections with the quotas and are more distant from the threshold, they have higher returns at the election. What does this mean? If you are farther from, if you are more distant from the threshold, it means that you have to change more your composition in terms of board members. And that means that the quotas imply a better recomposition, so more effects. And actually, in this case, the investors appreciate these changes and they give higher returns on the stock market. So possibly this is linked to our selection effect. So looking at the women who are electing these boards, they are good. There is no way, there is no need to appoint bad women somehow. These are women that have to run your company somehow, or at least, depending on what is the role of a board member, but they are in leadership positions in the firm. So they are good, they are qualified women, because we have seen this from the selection effect. The investors understand that they are qualified, and so they give a good, a positive result on the stock market. Okay, so basically this is my last slide. I want to recap a little bit what are, I started with my presentation was about the possible beneficial effects of having more gender balanced leadership on boards. And actually the main effects are related to selection, as I said, not only because women may be good in terms of, now we know that women are as educated as men, as competent, etc. So having more balance in the selection means not only that good women enter this decision-making positions, but also that men are better selected, because we think carefully when we have to decide who remains and who exits. So this was also called in another influential paper in the literature, has been called the crisis of the mediocre men. So somehow the mediocre men exit because now there are women around. The second is in terms of performance, and as I said, it's very difficult to find a causal impact on performance, but when we have this quotas, we can find, and this is good. And we found that there are basically, in our case, no differences in terms of performance, but certainly not a decrease. Obviously, here the next step is to understand whether those women, once they are part of the decision-making process, they also influence the agenda. So they, in addition to this type of representation, they also substantially change what are the decisions. And this is, in this case, in this paper, we couldn't test it, but of course it's important. And of course, there are many other contributions that also you have discussed in this days. And the last part, it refers to the leadership style. So the differences may also depend on the fact that women may have a different leadership style with respect to men. For example, more democratic style of leadership, interpersonal orientation, future-oriented, innovative. In our case, we have seen this decrease of the variability stock prices, which is related, for example, to risk aversion. So different women's traits, but the literature has also found other contributions, for example, related to different in competition, in negotiation, in the long-term horizon, or in the way of doing somehow networking. Of course, this is just to say that this paper is part of many other contributions in this area. Now this seems to be somehow the conclusions, the shared conclusion of the existing literature, but of course, much more has to be done also to understand better once women are in those positions or there is a gender balanced leadership, what is the substantial impact in terms of outcomes and in terms of decisions. So thank you very much, and I stop here.
Thank you very much, Paolo. It was a very exhaustive presentation. Ariane.
Thank you very much. My name is Ariane English. I'm a senior research fellow at the Institute for Women's Policy Research, which is a think tank, a very American institution in Washington, D.C. I wanted to thank you all on behalf of the Institute for Women's Policy Research for coming and participating in this event, particularly Fed has organized it on our behalf. Fed has asked me to talk about work-family policies. I hope you. Okay. If you can't hear me online, just send us a text. So that has asked me to talk about work-family policies in a comparative perspective.
Don't work anymore.
Okay. Go.
Okay. All right, so I'm going to talk about, just to quickly start off why we're talking about work-family policies and gender equality and what those, what's included in those, share a few data points, and then really end by thinking through why the US are so different. Okay. No. Okay, so just to remind everybody, wherever you look, these are data from the OECD family database, very good source for comparative data now. Whether you look at Norway or you look at Italy or Poland or Korea, women do less paid work than men, and they do more unpaid care and family work. How much more or less varies widely across the OECD countries, but the difference is there. And what's interesting in the OECD definition, and these are time use study data, is that they include education in their definition of paid work, which I think at one level works because education increases your human capital. At the other level, though, if you take the US, women have been more likely than men to have at least a 4-year college education since the mid-80s, but it was only in 2019 that the number of women equalized the number of men in the workforce with bachelor's degrees. How do I move this over? I didn't move this.
Oh, here.
Okay. Sorry, technology. Okay, so what do we talk about with work-family policies? Of course, the key ones, parental leave, childcare, and workplace flexibility, all kind of conceptualized around women and kids. Elder care is increasingly important, but we do not really have very good data yet to capture how it impacts women's labor market participation or other outcomes. And this is particularly so during COVID. COVID, of course, everywhere has intensified both the awareness and the involvement of women in unpaid work when school closed and looking after sick relatives. But on elder care, it's very hard, even data-wise, to pin down what has happened, even though closure of nursing care homes, elder care facilities are as severe as childcare facilities. Workplace flexibility is whether you work, the main one is part-time or no part-time work, but then also how much control you have over how your schedules are set. And then, of course, taxation and social security policies, which I'm not going to talk about, but which really structure how much women participate. Now, why look at work-family policies? Why were they introduced? We are now very focused on the first issue, the impact on economic growth and women's labor force participation rates. And whether you look at the IMF, the World Bank, the World Economic Forum, everybody highlights that there's a positive economic impact on facilitating women's workforce participation, women's employment. However, the other issues, women's economic security and equity, particularly also in old age, the issue of gender equality. Gender equality, I think, was much more behind the initial introduction of paid leave and childcare in the Scandinavian countries than at that stage a concern with labor force participation. The issue of equity and intergenerational inclusion and wealth accumulation is a particularly big point for the last decade or so, and in the US around racial equity, and then of course social cohesion. Growing up in Germany and the UK, we were always very jealous of France because there you had the école maternelle and you could put your little child, you had somewhere to go. And the reason for that, we then learned, was really socialization, to take the church out of the family, or more so than it was. Okay. Now, very simple, you probably all know this, the model. If you have good work-family policies, you can stay in the labor market, you can accumulate human capital, there will be a lower wage gap, fewer incentives for women to be the ones to be caregivers, and more elder care, more old age security. On the other hand, when there is no paid leave or too much paid leave, no flexibility, childcare is very expensive, given that we start out with the wage gap. The economic incentives as well as socialization mean that women are the ones who step out of the labor market or reduce their time, which means they don't only earn less during that time, but they also kind of, when they come back, start at a lower wage level. So looking at a few data points, starting with leave. What this slide shows is the number of weeks of paid leave available specifically to women. So it probably looks a little bit different from the charts with overall leave that is available. Firstly, I think the main issue is there's none in the US, at least none at the federal level. 7 states now do provide leave. But the second issue is that why the focus on paid leave, to some extent that focus has come because there has been greater emphasis on trying to get men to take up leave, and men won't take leave if it's not paid, particularly at the time of childbirth. So there now is more emphasis both on pay and on how much that pay replenishes what you earned while you were still in the labor market. The issue of unpaid leave, again, I grew up in Germany. What people tell me often in the US is, oh, you grew up in Germany, such wonderful paid family. You can take 3 years job protected leave. That, of course, is incredibly bad for gender equality because, you know, in career development, everybody assumes you are going to have kids. So it reduces the incentive for employers to develop you, and it really bakes in inequality. Oops. Oh. Okay. Childcare. This is a chart on 0 to 2-year-olds expenditure. It's part of GDP. Again, you can see the US hardly any expenditure. With the Scandinavian countries much more set up to support families and children at that stage, both for economic and for social equity reasons. And okay, and now the outcomes in terms of labor market participation. Here, what you can see, this shows the percent of the employment rate, as well as the percent of workers who, or women workers who work part-time among those who are employed. And here you can see the US no longer at the edge and also having a kind of mid-range labor force or employment rate, labor force participation or employment rate, but a very low part-time rate, right? So typically what we have, you either have high part-time work, like in Germany, for example, or the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, part-time work for women is, you know, over half, and often it's low part-time work. Whereas in the US, something like 26% of women work part-time. I circled also Sweden because it looks as if part-time work is very low, but in fact it's not. It's just because part-time work is measured as 30 hours per working at least, or less than 30 hours. And in Sweden, the kind of breakpoint is 28 hours, the way you can get the way you can get leave after you give birth. So why is the US such an outlier? First reason, of course, the legacy of slavery and ongoing racism. And that is, you know, if you think about when welfare states are founded or when they are expanded now, social cohesion helps a lot. The Scandinavian countries were very cohesive, and therefore, if you introduce measures such as, you know, jointly funding through taxation, the support of people who need support, it helps if you kind of think they may be like you. In the US, there is huge suspicion, discord, racism towards expanding the welfare state, and this also happens now. And you could see this in the 90s around the discussion of welfare queens, which is stereotyping of Black women. You can see this about discussions, families, you know, white working class families saying, I can support my family, these people don't, you know, this. Sorry, I should not wave my hands so much. So this also in the latest round now, where, as I said, we were very hopeful that we would get major investments in care and family leave. That kind of suspicion and discord is really probably the main reason that the expansion hasn't happened. But apart from that, there's also a strong tradition in the United States that family and parenthood are wonderful, but they're a bit like a luxury good, right? If you decide to buy a Mercedes, then it's up to you to repair it. We admire you for it, but you know, it's not social responsibility. A third reason in terms of understanding policy, particularly on paid leave, I think is the feminist movement or the women's movement in the United States, which is very focused on equity and not causing anything that may enhance discrimination against women. So, you know, in the way our paid family or the Family and Medical Leave Act is shaped is it's family leave for childcare as well as personal care, as well as for spousal care or elder care. And it is as available to fathers as it is to mothers. And several times there have been proposals available to just introduce narrowly maternity leave, and those have never passed. So that I think also is kind of aiming for something that is very gender equitable and very rounded, so that it does not lead to, say, the German effects, that the assumption is women will take leave and therefore we are not going to promote or hire them. The last point, I think, is fertility rates, and I felt I needed something to be a little bit more hopeful about. And because if you look at the point in time when, say, Germany or Japan, and I assume Italy, introduced more measures to make it easier to have kids and work, was when it became clear that fertility rates are so low, and demographic means you have more and more people getting into their 60s and 70s, that they felt we have to do something. And fertility rates in the United States are now falling to levels that are more seen in Europe. So they're like 1.9, 1.8. So possibly, maybe this will lead to more investment and the US finally supporting families in a better way. So thank you. And
Okay, Lynn.
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today. This is outside of what I normally do. I don't work in government. I don't work in academics. I work in the business field, specifically the luxury industry. And it's an industry that a lot of people like to make fun of. And they think it's flighty, and they think it's fashion shows, and they don't think about the entire consumer industry behind it. Personally, I've worked at both US and European luxury companies. I did a specialized MBA in France, and I spent a year in Italy as an undergrad. So I've spent a lot of time both living and working back and forth between Europe and the US. And along the way, I've worked with a lot of executive teams, as well as visiting a lot of markets and meeting with a lot of frontline sales people or sales professionals. I've visited a lot of warehouses, production facilities, and met with a lot of the artisans that are behind the entire industry. And I've also had a lot of people ask me, can you please get a job at Rolex because I'd like a discount? And my response as a true luxury executive is that if you can afford a Rolex, you can afford to pay full price. So the one thing about the industry, from the frontline salesperson to the person creating the product, to the salespeople and everyone in between, is we all have a great passion for the product and for the craft. That's universal. And then there are a subset of us who also tremendously enjoy the analytical part of the job. We're always digging down into data, and we're looking for sales trends and consumer trends, because really what it is a picture of sociology. Why do people do what they do? And the benefit of working in retail is every few months and every season, it changes. And then you have to start over again and make new theories. the numbers tell you one thing, but to figure out why people do what they do, you have to be in the stores, you have to be in the field, and you have to talk to people. And we're expected in the business world to make these changes every month, every quarter, every week, every season. We don't have the luxury of looking at the data and then putting it aside. So when I thought about what to do when I was growing up, for all these reasons, within the luxury industry, it's not just the passion for the products and the process and the craft, but it's also that this industry respects a certain subset of very specific skills. And there was also at the time a lot of women in this industry as compared to other industries. And I thought, won't it be great to work with other strong women that can pull women up? And for all these reasons, I came to the industry with this idea that there would be so much opportunity. And for a lot of people, there is. And it started out very much the way that I expected. You know, we were promoted from being assistants to account executives to buyers, and then some of us on to be sales managers or vice presidents or divisional merchandise managers. And along the way, I began to notice that of my cohort of people that I started at the bottom with, my colleagues began to exit the industry. Some of them changed industries for higher pay. Some of them, after being frustrated with 12 years of not getting the promotions they thought they deserved, and watching at sometimes, but not always, their male cohort being promoted above them, even if they came in with less years at the company or less experience. And so when I was asked by Federica to present on doing business as a woman in Europe and America, I realized I had a lot of anecdotal evidence and opinions, but a few things really stood out in the facts. And I realized that what's happening to my cohort in retail was really a part of a bigger societal trend that hasn't necessarily valued the contribution of women as much as they have the men. And while I have the big picture data that loudly screams of these alarming discrepancies, I wish we had more specific research with more transparency and more support to make the changes that we need to ensure that everyone in our world and in my industry has their best opportunity to live a satisfying life and to continue doing the work they love to do. So we know the statistics. Women on average make 82 cents on the dollar for every man in the US. If you're a woman of color, that drops to 62 cents. If you happen to be Native American or Hispanic, that drops even further. And over the course of time, to someone's income, for white women, it equates to about $500,000 less than a white male. For women of color, it's just shy of $1 million. And for women that are Hispanic or Native American, it's more than $1 million difference in their lifetime earnings. And we also know that salary and wage transparency can help eliminate these gaps. So why aren't we doing more? We need to drill down, in my opinion, to the more research, and sometimes the research isn't there. And if it is, maybe it's a messaging problem, and the general public doesn't learn about this enough. Maybe we don't have the right people in the room to listen to the message. I feel that we should be looking not just at executives and senior management, we should be quantitatively tracking salary and promotional data for different industries and different career paths over time. And we should be looking at the pay discrepancies in every possible way: gender, age, and race. We need more salary transparency, not less. In Colorado, they were the first state to pass a law that when you post a new position, you have to post the salary range. Congratulations to Colorado, it's amazing. In New York State next month, we have, or at least New York City for sure, we have the same policy passing, which will be great for people job searching in New York, which was an area during the pandemic that was hit particularly hard for workers. And we have 5 other US states that are required to share this information with candidates if they ask. They have to ask, they don't have to publish it. Like California, Connecticut, Nevada, Maryland, and Rhode Island. Congratulations to all those states for taking that step forward. However, other reports are honestly depressing. As of September of last year, AARP reported that in the US, 70% of jobless women over the age of 40 were long-term unemployed. And it went on to further note that women who are unemployed for that long typically take much longer to find a job. And when they do, they make less money than they did before. And in the EU, McKinsey estimated that women in France, Germany, and Spain will have an increased need for pandemic-induced job transitions at rates of 3.9 times higher than men. And those are incredibly large numbers. And again, why? It's really easy to say, oh, they decided to stay home with their kids. But why? From my viewpoint and from within my immediate industry peer set, these singular statistics or anecdotal sound bites don't give the true picture. I know from my own experience how much data that we do gathering information for product design and sales reporting and who shops where and when. Yet when it comes to women in the workforce, we get these 82 cents on the dollar statistics and almost nothing more. I feel like we need more transparency and relevant data sets that are updated regularly. Because I think if women felt that their contribution at work was valued by their companies and that appreciation had also come in the form of salary increases and promotions at the same level as their male cohort, that perhaps they wouldn't have made the same decision to exit the workforce during what many would consider their most valuable and productive work years. And would companies continue to age out workers prematurely if they knew they could be held accountable for doing so? Because when did years of experience become a detriment to any profession or business? PayScale, a company that compiles HR research and insights, estimates that at the current rate, the gender inequality gap won't close for another 208 years. But as a society, do we really have 200 years to wait to make some changes? I think we need more transparency and again, the data to back it up. And if we do have the data already, we need to scream it from the mountaintops and get it into the press in positive ways. I want to focus, I know we've talked already this morning about the top tier because it's so important. And we know that, globally, 5% of CEOs of large companies are men, or are women, only 5%. In the EU, it's around 8%. And for the US, it's less than 10. We also know that diversity in boards is paramount to creating a diversity-driven positive culture, as well as a boosted return on investment. And yet at the current rate, a 2021 Deloitte report estimated that without intervention, it won't be until 2074 before the number of board seats held by women and minorities reaches 40% with no action. And that's 52 years from now. There are positive signs, as were pointed out this morning. For example, Norway and France with mandates. Mandates have seemed to really work in Europe. But in the US, we're far behind. And as one of the speakers pointed out yesterday, California did pass a law in 2018, but the legislation was challenged and several companies didn't even complete their mandated analysis. They just took the hit. Maybe the stick wasn't big enough. Washington State also passed a 25% women on board seat mandate, and other states that have passed some sort of gender diverse legislation include Colorado, Pennsylvania, Hawaii, Massachusetts, Ohio, and New Jersey, but that leaves 42 states with no governance in the area. Aside from the financial gains that companies with diverse boards create, women not being on board sends the message that companies are refusing to allow women on boards. And it's not that big of a deal. There's a lot of talent. And sometimes the excuse is given that they can't find the appropriate female talent at that level. And I loved this gender balanced leadership word that was used in one of the previous presentations. I mean, a few things stand out to me is that maybe we've accepted a very narrow conception of what qualifies people for board membership. Maybe it's time to broaden, and I'm not saying to lower or compromise the talent. And as we've heard, it doesn't have to be that way, and it's generally not. But a bigger pipeline will yield better results. And we need to make clear the punishment and the benefit equation. The companies who defy these mandates will be sanctioned, and companies that do will definitely derive quantifiable positive results. In McKinsey's latest Women in the Workforce report, they note that having women on leadership positions can produce gains of up to 50% in a company's profits and share performance. So where is the downside? We know boards are extremely homogenous, but is it because the white men that sit on them only seek out other white men, truthfully, the bias is probably not intentional. It may be because people within their particular circle don't fit, and they might have a bias of which they're not even aware. I wish we had detailed stats to prove it, but in my industry, I have noted that traditionally women seem to move up faster in fields like PR, marketing, and human resources. How many executives, and I don't know this, but maybe you have the research, how many executives that sit on boards come from these particular areas? And if there's a disparity, wouldn't it help, especially with the push towards DEI and what a positive impact that can make on companies globally and on human lives? Wouldn't it make sense to have someone like that sitting on your board, solve the problems before they happen? Simultaneously, schools such as Harvard offer programs to train people to be sitting on boards. How difficult would it be to send these high potential women in leadership positions to these 2-day, week-long courses to help get them up to par to where they need to be considered for these other positions? Because Rita, yesterday, I loved your quote about how women are hired for what they know and men are hired for the potential. So let's give them some potential. This is about the leadership ladder, and we all know it needs to change. McKinsey does an amazing annual study, and it clearly points out where the biggest bottleneck is for women. In the US, for every 100 men promoted to manager position, only 86 women are promoted. And it gets far worse, and the percentages go down when you see who gets promoted to director or vice president, or even fewer to SVP or C-suite or CEO levels. In the EU as well, the title of profession with the biggest differences in hourly earnings are managers as well, with 23% less in pay for women than men. So I think we can draw a straight line to the C-suite from this manager level, but we need to change the pipeline. And perhaps we should be looking at education as well. Bloomberg recently published that of 55 business schools in the US that it reviewed, women were 41% of incoming classes, and this is up from 31% in 2011. So this is a positive trend. But I think we need to start tracking this cohort now and get ahead of the trend. We should be studying what fields are they studying, and when they graduate, what kinds of jobs do they move into? And is it a job that will actually move them up? And what business fields have the most salary movement? Could we and should we add coursework to the programs, the MBA programs that include a course in this particular field or industry? And also, should there be a mandatory course in MBA classes on board leadership? I don't know, but maybe all of you have the data. Maybe we should share it. And I know it sounds absurd, but it needs to be said. This is the age of information. And at this critical juncture, we don't have clearly enough. Another example on feedback is that there's research to suggest that women get different feedback at work than men, which may be fine, but the feedback overall is invariably more negative. In a study done on the topic, 76% of the negative feedback given to women in their performance reviews included a personality criticism, with comments such as, the woman was abrasive, she was judgmental, or she was strident. While only 2% of the men's reviews had such comments. Most of their feedback was on performance-based statistics that they could improve. And I think that's a huge thing to consider, because it takes training to managers and to the HR teams to be able to correct this. And thinking back to what I said earlier, if an HR executive, especially one that was trained in DEI, was on the board, would this sort of negative and unhelpful feedback be changed into something more constructive for not just women, but also for men? I think that if we turn this human resources role into something more dynamic, and some companies absolutely have already done this or are working on it, and it's incredible, instead of just doing what they're told, and they could be as respected as the other areas of sales and product management as their peers, and they could stand up for what is right and actually make some of these changes. Because right now, and especially during the pandemic, this task fell to all levels of management who have had to navigate it and sometimes answer questions without the right tools. By establishing equality mandates to boards, by broadening how we recruit and hire for all management and executive positions, and by increasing our awareness at a community level of what is considered a microaggression and why it's bad, and training teams about equitable language and reviews, we could definitely challenge the status quo in a positive way. And finally, COVID changed everything. And this singular global event fundamentally changed every aspect of our personal lives, how we work, how we play, how we buy, how we spend our days, excuse me. And my impression, at least, is that consumers and employees proved that they were much more agile and could make the shift to a new way of buying, working, and learning far faster than their companies and their corporate bosses. This global health crisis accelerated the ideas of working from home, from moving data to a cloud-based environment that's accessible from anywhere, and matching access to that data with compliance. In every area, we can see ways that this transformation could be beneficial. For example, reduction in cost of office space, because work can essentially be done from anywhere in the world. And a lot of companies and people have proven that this actually worked. If we make the goal and we make a conscious effort to use what we have learned over the past few years, we could create a post-COVID work environment that could be so much better for everyone, including women, and not just for women in tech. Furthermore, with these new hybrid environments, companies would be encouraged to foster trust with their employees, who would also then be held accountable primarily for the merit of their work than for face time. And perhaps this is a concept that in academia you already have, but in the business world and in a corporate world, it doesn't exist so much unless you work in a tech industry. As for retail, I can testify how disrupted the industry has been during COVID. Companies that weren't selling online already had to really speed up their digital transformation. It was very easy to transfer, sales, like wholesale sales teams or e-commerce or customer service to work from home environments. And in retail, it didn't work for everyone. We still have retail stores. You still have, customer service in face at stores. You have the artisans who create the product. You have the product development teams. For some, it doesn't make sense, but for others, it does. And that leaves an opportunity for women, I feel. If companies and industries don't change or think about how they could change, they will fall behind, especially when it comes to sourcing top-rated talent. Statistics show us that the pandemic affected women in the workforce tremendously, much more so than men. And also, with increasingly international teams, as we've discussed this morning, the discussion of benefits is real. I won't go into too much details, but the US has a zero vacation mandated policy. Generally 76% of people receive 2 weeks of vacation after they've worked for a company for a year, but it's not guaranteed. And you have to work several years to acquire additional vacation. I mean, we used to look from the American side at the Europeans in awe. Like, not only do you get 4 or 5 weeks of vacation, but you can actually take it when you want to. You can take 4 weeks at a time. Many of us struggle to take 1 week, much less a 2-week vacation. So for us, it's almost unfathomable to think that we could disconnect and refresh ourselves given 3, 4, 5 weeks. It's incredible. And I'm not advocating that all Americans should take the entire month off of August. It's actually quite disruptive to supply chains and to workflows. But it's the stark culture contrast that in Europe, it's accepted as almost as a right, whereas in the US, you have to make excuses. Like, I need to take a personal health day. Like, you have to make some sort of, excuse to take your vacation. And I don't think that's right. Everybody deserves some downtime to regroup. And there are other topics that European women don't have to worry about nearly as much as Americans that cause Americans a lot of stress. And it's not just the vacation or when we can take it, but your health insurance is tied to your job. Like, if you lose your job, you can pay upwards of $1,000 per an individual a month, or up to $3,500 and upwards for a family. And I think we can all agree that that's unfathomable when you're not working. It's a huge expense. This level of stress is unsustainable in the long term, and I think that we've already seen a lot of changes with the next generation of workers. They're not willing to tolerate companies clinging to their archaic ways of working or to the workplace's current lack of inclusivity. They're walking away from their jobs a year or two into the position. They're no longer staying 12 years at a company that doesn't value them, won't promote them, or won't allow them their fair share of voice in spite of their experience. And while they watch their male colleagues rise to the top ahead of them, they're finding their voice and they're leaving. So I believe that instead of looking at doing business, and I just also should say, like, we should be thankful to this younger set of workers for their unwavering level of confidence, because I think they have a chance that maybe the rest of us haven't had to make things much more equitable. And I think we should all be challenging our companies and asking ourselves what we want to look like 2 years from now and figure out how to build a bridge. There is no downside. You know, there's obviously examples that are benefit and are good examples of what we could be doing to make things better coming from Europe, like the mandated board seat quotas. And there's good things from the US, like this evolution of tech that would give women the opportunity to work from anywhere in the world that we could be using. I think, you know, if we do this, we could create a good roadmap for change, and then everyone wins. And I've been told I have time. Thank you.
So, thank you so much, Pauline. Let me silence this, otherwise we. Okay. Or whoever wants to answer. So Bonnie asked, what is the most valuable lesson the US can borrow from European labor market practice and vice versa? Who wants to answer?
I'm happy to start.
Yeah.
So I used to work with somebody called Joan Williams, who set up Center for Work-Life Law, particularly to address discrimination women faced in the legal profession, then beyond. And what she used to say is the United States are the best labor market for women if you can work as a man, right? If you are available all the time, and if you don't have kids or don't spend on your time because discrimination, there's an assumption that to some extent you're given a chance, much more than in other countries. However, if you have caregiving responsibilities, if you want to spend time with your kids, it's the worst labor market. You're penalized, but also you're in constant stress. So I think we need to take some of the gender equity assumptions from the US and have real equity as a guiding principle in all kind of policies that we have, including in paid leave. But we need to take up Colleen's point that people are dying of stress and we need more paid time, everybody, women and men.
Yeah. We also have another question. Question one, Italy, what is the percent of women on executive board position versus non-executive position in the 2011-2020 evolution? And then question two, any EU other regulation quotas for executive board positions? I guess this is for you, Paola.
Yes. Okay. So the most of the women went because of the board gender quotas law are non-executive. Okay, so executive board positions are very little. The percentage is around probably that. I don't know. I don't have the exact numbers now by heart, but it's very limited. All of them are non-executive. And this is also the problem, because I mean, the idea is that that companies recruited women outside, so from experts, from other companies, from other professions, from academia, etc. But what they still have to do is to create their own pipeline, like promoting women internally in order to have them to be, to have the possibility to have a women also as executive positions. So that's a critical point. That's a crucial point, and that's also something where quotas are not a magic recipe. So you cannot change the culture of a company because of the quota only, and what is needed is more. We're working, for example, now a lot with stereotypes and with several practices which can be useful for companies in order to change and to prepare a pipeline of managers and people ready for boards. That's more difficult. And any other regulations for executive board positions? Yes, there are many in Europe, and they are quite different. I mean, most of them have quotas like 1/3, and Italy is the only one with the temporary provision, because in the other countries it's permanent. It's even up to 40%. I mentioned Norway, but it's also in France. It's also now in Germany, a little bit later than Italy, but it's also in Germany. They have it in Portugal, in Austria. I mean, almost many countries in Europe, almost all of them. So it's not always the same, but the percentages are very similar, and also these are hard laws everywhere. So it's basically companies are required to do them. So it's very widespread. And this is also why the European directive, which mainly was blocked by the UK, and now because UK, with the Brexit, they are not there anymore, probably. So this will not be an obstacle. Mainly UK went for a different process, like a recommendation or just soft measures, which worked. But the other countries in Europe did not. We always also do the parallel with Spain. Spain also went for a soft recommendation, so not strong quotas. They started well before, like 10 years before Italy. They started, but it was not basically. It was a strong recommendation, but if companies do not comply, nothing happens. Basically, that's the idea. The penalty is very little. And so the percentage of women is much lower. In Italy now it's 40%, and they have never reached more than 20-25. So it seems that when it's strong, it's obviously easier to reach rapidly these percentages. And also with respect to the previous question, the European versus the US, I understand the logic, but Europe is very diversified. Okay, so it's very difficult to say to think at Europe as overall, because we have the Scandinavian countries. I mean, the Nordic model is really much better in terms of women's for labor force participation, for gender statistics, for services, daycare centers. Possibility to have paternity leaves, etc. The continental Europe has different models, but still many sometimes quite advanced. As the Mediterranean are still lag behind. There is now a lot of investment because of these plans in Europe, the so-called Next Generation EU. So the plans in Europe that have been introduced for after the COVID, for the recovery after the pandemic. So there is a lot of money now coming to the different governments. In Italy, for example, a very substantial one. And the idea is that we try to understand whether these resources can be used also for the family policies and for finally investing into, for example, childcare services or financing paternity leaves, etc. Childcare, there is a lot of attention, especially to childcare policies, because the experience of the Nordic countries is that what really seems to support female careers and participation to the labor market, first access and then careers, is the possibility to have childcare, and also not very expensive. I mean, not only that it exists, but it's also that you can also afford it. That seems to be the policy that works better. But for example, also sharing between father and mothers, and therefore the paternity leaves is also very well discussed. In many countries, they have, even fathers have like 1 or 2 months. Some countries are discussing to have equal leaves for men and women at the same time. In Italy, for example, we only have 10 days for fathers and 5 months for mother. But still, this is another chapter, because equality, because men's participation into care, etc., seems to be positively, significantly related always with outcomes for women on the labor market. But it's very difficult to say Europe as a block, let's say.
All right. I would say we're closing here because we're running over time. And thank you very much to everyone.